Campbell is the author of Morning in South Africa, published in 2016, in which he then offered a positive review of the country's political trajectory given the strength of its democratic institutions. And despite the events of widespread looting and arson in the aftermath of former President Jacob Zuma's incarceration, it's done little to change that view.
Certainly, the deplorable violence that has taken place over the past week or so has grabbed the headlines. It's been the focus of media attention, and it's certainly serious enough. But it overshadows what I think is the most important development over the past month or so. And that is the operation of the South African judiciary and the independence of that judiciary, the rule of law, and the holding accountable of a former head of state, something which is not just extraordinary in an African context, but it's extraordinary in a worldwide context.
In his blog, Africa in Transition, he writes that as the rioting intensified, it morphed from a protest over Zuma's fate into an expression of deep-seated grievance among the poor and marginalized.
The rioting morphed into something that was much more anarchic. Something that reflected deep-seated frustration, particularly in certain areas and certain parts of the country, notably KwaZulu-Natal, and notably in the townships, particularly in Gauteng. Now, why rioting broke out in place A versus place B is something that requires, I think, a good deal of investigation. One size does not fit all.
As the infighting in the African National Congress and its ramifications for the political experiment that is South Africa continues to weigh on any analysis of the country's future.
It has been in power for a very long time. Its trajectory reminds me a bit of the Indian National Congress, and with many of the same stresses and strains that the Indian National Congress faced after it had been in power for a long time. Well, what did the Congress Party of India do? It eventually split into a number of different political parties. I wouldn't be surprised if the ANC doesn't similarly split into a number of different political parties.
Campbell also suggested that if the present government showed discretion and skill, that it could emerge from what he called a bad patch in the face of a weak opposition.
The opposition was strongest as a foil against the Zuma administration and its shortcomings. The Zuma administration has now gone away, which means that the opposition parties have to regroup.
More pertinent to Campbell is the growing gulf between the country's remarkable success in building strong democratic institutions and its much slower progress in meeting the material needs and aspirations of the majority of its people. Sherwin, Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
And Sherwin joins us live from New York right now. Sherwin, thank you. I think so many of us are feeling depressed and anxious after last week, but the main thrust of what Ambassador Campbell is saying that if you look at it and if you focus on things like the independent judiciary, things like that, then South Africa is stronger than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, it's a very positive perspective from Ambassador Campbell, and probably very difficult for South Africans who have lived through this experience to embrace that view. I'll tell you why that view matters from an international perspective, from an investment perspective. Campbell is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. This is a think tank, an academic think tank of international repute that has hosted the likes of former President Jacob Zuma in his capacity as head of state here in New York. It has hosted the likes of current President Cyril Ramaphosa for a discussion on the future of South Africa. It has hosted Pravin Gordhan in his capacity as finance minister for a roundtable with American investors. So what they say matters to an international audience. And what Campbell is saying here is, despite how you might be feeling right now, despite how you might be feeling about the damaged infrastructure and the looting and the arson, the bedrocks of South Africa's democracy have stood firm. It's something I pressed him on. I asked him, Francis, since the writing of that book of his in 2016, Morning in South Africa, essentially about the sun, rising in the east for South Africa's political trajectory, I asked him if the last 2 weeks had changed that perspective. This was his response.
No, there is nothing that really causes me to revise that assessment. The really interesting thing about the media attacks and the attacks on the judiciary is that they were all successfully resisted. A difference between 2016 and the present is that at the top, the South African government is far more credible, far more effective than it was in 2016.
So a little bit of good news here from certainly a reputable international institution, also drawing comparisons, Francis, with some of the rioting, looting and arson we experienced in the aftermath of police violence and killings of black and brown men in the United States. And no one is really questioning the fundamental bedrock of American institutions. And I think the same is now being said about those institutions in South Africa today.
I see he drew on that Dickens quote. He wrote in his blog that South Africa sees the best of times and the worst of times. How did he explain that dichotomy?
Yeah, it's an interesting narrative, certainly. He talks about the successes, particularly in the creation of South Africa's Chapter 9 institutions. When you think of the Auditor General, the Independent Electoral Commission, or the Public Protector that it might be argued led to many of the events we are seeing today, South Africa's Human Rights Commission. These are bedrock institutions where South Africa's transition has succeeded. But then he also talks about the economic and social marginalization of the majority of South Africans, these two worlds where the economy is still dominated by the white minority and a very small black elite. And he really tries to grapple with these two divergent narratives that have come to be very emblematic of the South Africa we know today. It's something I asked Ambassador Campbell his response here.
The great success of the transition, it was essentially in governance, in the establishment of a genuine democracy conducted according to the rule of law. What the transition did not succeed in doing was addressing the extreme inequalities that permeate South African society. Inequalities. I say that as opposed to poverty, because while poverty is far from having been defeated in South Africa, still there was rather remarkable progress made in reducing the percentage of the population living in extreme poverty. I think the future of South Africa, presuming that the present South African government continues to show discretion and skill, which I think it has in responding to the current rioting, presuming that continues, will be an emergence from this particular bad patch. And in my view, the government's overall approach to the economy is, again, over time, likely to start to bear fruit.
So, Francis, what Ambassador Campbell addresses less explicitly is what happens to those success stories, those institutions that have now succeeded in establishing South Africa as one of the preeminent democracies around the world. What happens if the marginalization of the majority, if the socio-economic redress does not happen in the short to medium term? Does the bad patch then repeat itself? And I think this is the dynamic that not only South Africa's leaders, but certainly the broader society has to grapple with, given the fact that this is an urgent matter, youth unemployment above 60%. What happens to idle hands the longer this continues? And I think that really is the question facing all of us.
So action needed, but at least some positivity there, Sherwin, around the future. Thank you for leaving us with that. Sherwin Bryce-Pease live from New York. And that is a wrap of the show. Thank you for being with us on The Full View tonight.